You know, for a while, it looked like we would never get a sequel to Guillermo del Toro's robot vs. Kaiju blockbuster extravaganza, Pacific Rim. The film didn't really perform well financially in the US, and del Toro moved on to other projects. But fortunately, that was not the end of the franchise, because despite initial reports, Pacific Rim actually did make money, and this new one, Pacific Rim Uprising, solely exists because the first film was a mega hit in China, and the new film had the backing of a group of Chinese investors who wanted a new Pacific Rim film catered to an international market. So yeah, thanks China for Pacific Rim Uprising, which is a movie that is on the whole pretty decent, even if it is rough around the edges. The story takes place 10 years after the end of the first one and follows Jake Pentecost, played by the up-and-coming movie star John Boyega, who is the son of the late Stacker Pentecost, who was a hero who died in the last movie. Jake is definitely not his father's son in the slightest, and that he shirks his responsibility whenever possible and scavenges Jaeger tech so he can sell it on the black market. However, when one of his heists goes awry, he and his accomplice Amara, who is a spunky Jaeger mechanic, are brought into the Jaeger program in order to prepare recruits just in case the Kaiju return. Admittedly, the movie is incredibly flawed. The first really big problem in Pacific Rim Uprising is that the first half of the film has no real narrative stakes that get you invested in the story. I mean, the first Pacific Rim got you hooked by showing the audience the threat of the Kaiju, and in how it clearly explained that the Jaeger program was being shut down by the United Nations of Robots at a time when the Kaiju were preparing an attack that would exterminate all life on Earth. You know, it's really hard not to get caught up in all that. In Uprising, however, there are no real threats to fear or get excited about for the first half of the film, and instead director Steven Deknight tries to focus more on character development, which quite honestly isn't very good aside from John Boyega, who goes through a character arc to shed his bad boy persona and become the ranger his father wanted him to be. But as I said, aside from that, the rest of the film is not up to snuff. Nathan Lambert, played by Scott Eastwood, yep, they're related, is the captain of a recruit of rangers and tries to get over his past hang-ups with Boyega, but Eastwood is really miscast and is just a pretty face and kinda sweet. In fact, he's way too much of a heartthrob to be believable in this role. Watching him be a military commander is about as believable as the Sergeant Major from Full Metal Jacket being played by Luke Wilson.
No, they stack shit that high!
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be out of the toilet.
Speaking of Full Metal Jacket, the film also does have another subplot of how the recruit orientation and how Amani struggles to fit in, but not enough time is spent on this arc to be interesting. So yeah, most of the subplots in the first half of the film aren't fleshed out enough to warrant giving a shit. While sure, Uprising is trying to emulate the first Pacific Rim and how it was a slow burn that took its time to build up the character's world and story before we got into the monster punching action, the thing is, where Raleigh and Mako's relationship was interesting and endearing at times, and was also critical to advancing the main plot where they had to save the world from an imminent threat, for some odd reason, Steven Deknight decided to rehash the same old plot angle where Jake and Amani must get over their hang-ups, and they go through so many of the same character setups as Raleigh and Mako did in the first one that I almost believe there is a glitch in the Matrix. So yeah, the character development misses the mark more than it hits, and the lack of any immediate threat makes the first half of the film feel like a slog. However, things do pick up in the second half of Pacific Rim Uprising when the digital, computerized action sequences begin, because holy shit, these action scenes are fluid and electric. While some fans may lament over how the Jaeger's movements are much more fluid and admittedly cartoonishly CG to the slow lumbering Jaegers in the first one, the action sequences are an incredible sight to behold in terms of how well the Jaegers and the Kaiju move and how stylized the action is in terms of its vibrant visuals. Even better is that the plot picks up steam and has some cool narrative surprises that I won't spoil here, but suffice to say they are very good, and the character work becomes more engaging as the film narratively and thematically becomes another one of those heroes for a new generation rallying cry that has become very popular these days. And it actually works out pretty well, even with the caveat that this thematic arc is on the nose as hell. But hey, this movie's main focus is watching robots punch monsters in the face, so subtlety has never really been Pacific Rim's strong suit. However, something I did find lacking even in the second half of Uprising is that it's missing del Toro's charm and heart. The first Pacific Rim came from a place of love for B-movies and Japanese kaiju films. From the visuals, the comedy relief, etc., they were all based around capturing that feel of an old-school Japanese B-movie but with a blockbuster budget. Yet Steven Deknight film feels more like it's trying just to emulate every other robot vs. monster blockbuster blockbuster, which I mean is fine, I can get behind that, but it lacks the same creative passion that made the first Pacific Rim so awesome. I mean, you can even see this in the comedy relief, because in the first Pacific Rim, the comedy relief was so effective because it played up on the cheesiness and ridiculous tropes from those said old-style B-movies. You can see that in the characters of Dr. Gottlieb and Newt, who are so over the top, they're absolutely ridiculous. I mean, seriously, look at that fucking chalkboard. It's hysterical. Yet in Uprising, the comedy comes from a more modern, juvenile place and often doesn't land. And this is even true of Newt and Gottlieb, who are back. And while they're still pretty good, they're just missing that charm they had from the first one.
But say it with me, my man. We're gonna own this bad boy. By Jove, we are going to own this thing for sure.
Also, as far as returning characters go, Mako is in the movie for a few scenes, but isn't a major character. Just letting you know before you get too excited. The last thing worth noting is that holy shit, you can tell this movie is pandered to Chinese audiences. While this isn't necessarily a bad thing because, hey, we get movies that pander to American sensibilities all the fucking time, but I call out propaganda and political pandering whenever it's obvious, and damn does this movie bow down to its Chinese overlords. Still, maybe that direction of the movie is fair, because as I said at the beginning of this review, the only reason why we even have a second Pacific Rim is that Chinese audiences went to see the first one where American ones just didn't. And Chinese audiences will likely be the reason that we get a sequel to Uprising as well. And even though the first half of the film was rough, the character work was dodgy, story was a slog for a good chunk of the movie, the last half was enjoyable enough to make the film a solid watch that had moments of pure fun. My final score for Pacific Rim Uprising is a 6.5 out of 10. It's solid and worth a watch, especially if you're fans of the first one. Hopefully the inevitable sequel will shore up the problems in this one, but until then, I'll see you on the next video. This is Biological Riley, signing out.